This program is made possible in part thanks to generous donations from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to the Suzanne Atwell Show. In this edition, Black History Month 2022, the struggle continues. Our focus, voting rights, lessons learned, and growing up Black in Sarasota. Fueled by Trump's big lie and enacted by Republican-led state legislatures, at least 19 states passed laws in 2021 that restrict voting access. In Washington, D.C., the day after the Martin Luther King holiday, the U.S. Senate failed to break a GOP filibuster on voting legislation. The bill combined the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In Florida, nearly 2 years after voters approved a constitutional amendment allowing felons to vote, Governor DeSantis led a GOP-controlled legislature to pass a law requiring felons to pay back fines. As this show is posted, multiple lawsuits have been filed to challenge Florida's restrictive voting law, SB 90. We'll continue to follow this story and keep you updated. Our local history is rich with the contributions of African Americans, but like the rest of America, it is also a story of racial injustice and the struggle for freedom. The wilderness of Spanish Florida was a destination for enslaved persons seeking freedom. Archaeological work confirms one of the largest colonies stretched from Bradenton to Sarasota Bay, called Angola. It existed between 1812 and 1821. Early leaders included Lewis Colson and his wife Irene, who arrived in 1885. He worked with founding Scottish investors and is reported to have driven the first stake at 5 Points, platting the town of Sarasota. The Black community of Overtown goes back just as far. Located in what is now the Rosemary District, it was designated a U.S. Historic District in 2002. At the beginning of the 20th century, when Sarasota was incorporated, Black labor fed the economic engine of a rapidly growing city. Leonard Reed worked with legendary mayor Colonel John Gillespie to design and manage the grounds of the city's first golf course. It was Black workers who helped build the tracks into town for the Seaboard Airline Railway when the first car arrived in 1903. The 40-acre subdivision of Newtown was platted in 1914. It consisted of 240 lots. While the local economy relied heavily on Black workers, they did not share equally in the growing prosperity. White separatism and Jim Crow held a tight grip on where African Americans could go, where they could live, where they could get an education. It took until 1925 for the first public school to be built for African Americans in Sarasota. Of course, it was segregated. The first graduating class at Booker High was in 1935. The 50s and 60s saw the beginning of the civil rights movement in Sarasota. The Colored Women's Civic Club in Newtown was on the front line of the struggle. Beaches were for whites only. Blacks were considered bad for tourism. On October 3, 1955, local protesters went to Lido Beach and waded into the water. Over a decade later, the city defied the Civil Rights Act and passed on an ordinance making interracial beaches illegal. In 1957, the struggle to integrate county libraries began when a young college student, Dr. Edward James, confronted powerful city manager Ken Thompson. More than 20 years later, in 1979, Dr. James and 3 other Black activists filed a federal lawsuit that changed the course of Sarasota history. It was that landmark ruling that accounts for today's district elections. 1985, Fred Atkins becomes the first African American commissioner in the city of Sarasota. 2001, first black woman, Carolyn Mason, becomes mayor of Sarasota. Mason also broke both color and gender lines at the Sarasota County Commission. Later in the show, we talk with Sheila Sanders, who, like Carolyn Mason, broke both color and gender lines. But first, a local leader who lived through the civil rights era and helped shape the course of Black history in Sarasota, Mr. Walter Gilbert. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Walter.
Good morning.
As we reflect on the meaning of Black History Month, story of voting rights in the city of Sarasota, which we should, by the way, never forget, you were there, you were part of it, you struggled with it. Could you talk about your personal experience? Let our viewers know what your role in all that was.
Well, it's quite interesting to remember those days. As a young person here, I figured out that some things wasn't happening in our community that was happening in other areas of the city. And I figured out at the same time it was because we didn't have representation at the levels of decision making with the city. So at the time I said, well, as a member of NAACP, we need to go and address this. So that was our first move. From there, we decided that the only way we could get anything done as far as getting representation was to change the process that commissioners were elected. So we got about the business of getting that done. And we figured out that the only way to get this representation was to sue the city, because other communities across the nation was filing federal lawsuits against their communities and winning and getting representation. So we figured the only way to get a person elected was to prove that a person couldn't get elected. So as president of the branch at the time, we decided to head that fight. But the NAACP itself could not sue the city. It had to be a suit brought by residents, so as the people that were being harmed. So we had 4 members of our branch file a lawsuit under their names for single members district voting in the city of Sarasota. And I was a guinea pig. I ran 3 times and got proven that I couldn't win. Hated every minute of it.
3 times?
Yeah. And you know, every time we got closer and closer, but they could always go get numbers. You know, they could always go get some more votes. You know, we were limited to our community for our votes. You know, so we won, and we had a new system set up in Sarasota, which is the single member district voting.
Right, right. And that was a result of it.
That was a result of it, and we're still operating under that today.
You know, here we are today in the wake of the big lie. Dozens of states, including our Florida, are enacting laws that make it very difficult to vote, especially for minorities. Why is this happening?
I think it's because of certain communities in our communities wanting to keep the status quo. As populations change, the numbers change, all of a sudden they realize that their power is going to be diminished if certain people do vote. But that's just the process. I mean, they need to get over it. That's the way it happens. So power never wants to give up power. So that's their way of keeping it as narrow as they can and to keep their power base in place. So they have to come up with mechanisms to do that, and that's why they're doing these certain things, hoping that they can still control the narrative.
Sarasota County's redistricted maps. Here's a loaded one. The lawsuit failed. Apparently, it's not illegal to gerrymander districts in the name of political gain, as long as there is no proof that civil rights were violated. So how do you think this decision affects the local black community's confidence in the system.
And it does hurt the black community, no doubt.
Sure.
No doubt. Because, you know, people that gets elected serve the people that elected them. Mm-hmm. So if we've got most of the black community that's voting Democrat, mm-hmm. they're not going to get anything.
Mm-hmm. How do you change that?
Well, the only way to change it, considering where we are with the parties and the numbers, is to hope that we could get some people in that understand and are compassionate enough to know that we need to do some things different. Like I say, power's not going to really give up power without pushing on them. So we have to do what we have to do. And when I say we, I mean people that don't believe in this system to the point where one group of people have all the power. So we means Republicans, Democrats, Independents that believe in sharing and giving and having a community that's inclusive come together and address that to the people that's elected officials.
So let's slide back into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Where are we going with this? We are so bitterly divided as of today.
We lived in a time when having voting rights meant something to the entire country without some politician telling you, no, we don't. So the political landscape is so skewed right now that people follow party leaders to the end of the road, off the cliff, so to speak. That's what's happening with this. So until the people, once again, we're going to have to go back to Dr. King days and the things that happened then. We're going to have to start doing that stuff again to bring attention to the wrongness of this thinking process.
Speaking of Dr. Martin Luther King, I'd like to end on a hypothetical. If Dr. King was alive today to see the Voting Rights Act being marginalized, we can use that word, the rise of Donald Trump, January 6th, what lessons of history would he say we have really failed to learn?
He would be all over this. He would, there's no telling what, I mean, just sitting there, just hypothetically, Dr. King would, I think, bring a national awareness to this, that it would not be just talked about in pockets like it is now. He would bring people together. You would see people in the streets again. You would see churches activated again. You would see the different organizations forming coalitions to go against this. And you would see people losing their seats in Congress and the Senate because of this. Because that's what happened before.
Yeah.
You know, with the 64, you know, the 65 acts that Lyndon Johnson, you would have that type of leadership happening again because he would mobilize people like he did before.
Fabulous. We miss him. We miss that.
We miss not only him, we miss that type of leadership. We miss that type of commitment from somebody that sees their beliefs and thoughts to the very end, like he did, to the very end of his life. He got killed because of his beliefs and his work. You don't have people, unfortunately, in positions that he held that's willing to go that far. You know, as soon as they get some pushback, they go away now. You know, it's just a different time. But I do believe that time is going to develop somebody like him again. Because, you know, I use a description of this whole civil rights thing and our whole country thing. I said we're in the third phase of it now. And what do I mean by that? I mean that after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, that was our first phase. All right? And they shut that off after a little progress. Then the second phase was when Dr. King and those leaders, Malcolm X and those guys came along. And we got a lot out of that. We rode that horse and they killed those guys. All right? We're in the third phase. So what's the third phase? The third phase is George Floyd. And what happened after that. And what makes the third phase different is the people that was in the streets. If you look at the faces of those people that was in the streets, they weren't all black.
Yeah, right.
They weren't all this or all that, even the leaderships.
Right.
So you had in the streets those little kids that grew up in timeout. that
Exactly.
that timeout didn't work for. They were in the streets. They were leading the protests. They was throwing the rocks and bottles. So we're in the third phase now, and let's see what happens out of it.
Walter certainly leaves us with something to ponder, and like many in our generation, he recognizes that freedom is not free. The struggle continues. We turn next to a frequent guest and a friend of the show, Pastor Kelvin Lumpkin. He wasn't around back in Walter's day, but he's equally committed to the cause. Once again, we're going to turn to you for great insight.
Okay.
Dr. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice."
Amen.
Well, it seems to be getting longer, and is it bending in the wrong direction?
That's a great question, man. Yeah, I love this country. God knows I do. But I feel like I've been traumatized as an American. I mean, I think I have real trauma in these last couple of years. You know, what I saw on January 6th, it really messed me up. I don't think the average American realizes how fragile our democracy is. And I mean, it really is. And I think everybody who's privileged to be elected to high office, especially federal office, has this enormous responsibility to, above politics, to help preserve our democracy, to protect this thing. I think that's first and foremost above any partisan thing. And I see that not happening. I see injustice seeming to win, and it kind of freaks me out. And so, I'm not disillusioned per se. I'm still hopeful about America, and I love our ability to correct ourselves, but I'm concerned at the road we're going down.
Absolutely. Last month, about 800 religious leaders sent a letter to the president and Congress urging passage of the voting rights legislation. Is that something you support?
Absolutely. Anything, and that's another layer of trauma is after the election, all of these efforts to hinder people's ability to vote. That's always frightening. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we don't need IDs or safeguards, but we ought to be making voting easier, you know? And so you see this reaction every time the election doesn't go somebody's way, let's try to make it harder. And that's pretty frightening, and we're actually going down a scary road. We're going down, I'm not going to say civil war or anything, God forbid, but I don't like this level of division. It's this something like I've never seen in my lifetime. Of course, there's always going to be partisan politics, but this is a level of division and irrationality on some sides that is pretty disturbing to me.
Well, it's interesting that even fairly recently, I was called 2006 recently, that we reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. Why could we do it then? That passed unanimously in the Senate and overwhelmingly in the House. 2006. Why can't we do that now? Why is it such a struggle today?
And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that this new breed of politician is not putting country first. And many of them are entertaining these dangerous lies. I mean, listen, you may not like who gets elected, but the beautiful thing about America is our democracy. Whether you like who gets elected or not, that's not the point. What I love about our country is that the outgoing president normally shakes hands with the incoming president. He's there when the new president takes the oath of office, and we didn't have that this time. And that's, I don't think we can take that lightly. And so the fact that a new breed of politicians won't tell the truth, keep allowing these lies to fester, is pretty scary. And what's even more sinister is that many of them know really the truth, know what happened, but don't have the courage to speak to it.
How active is your church in terms of organizing, getting the vote out, things like that?
Well, you know, I try not to be too political from the pulpit. But I do try to speak to issues, and it's a fine line, you know.
Sure.
Because I don't want a church of people with just one party, one race, so I have to be very careful. But there are times when you just have to speak what's right. And when it comes to voting, I've always, and always will, encourage our people to get out to vote, and use our resources to our vans and put them at, listen, we can take you to the polling place, and
Sure.
we've participated with other community organizations to help people get out to vote. And we always will, not trying to tell people how to vote.
Right.
I won't do that. I don't let candidates speak at our church.
Has there been any pushback that, wait a minute, I don't want to be told, what to do?
I think people want to know how to think about things, how to.
Yeah.
And there were some issues these past couple of years, whether it be George Floyd, the Capitol riots, where I couldn't keep quiet. And I'm not in charge of anybody else's pulpit, but I had people from other churches saying, I'm glad you spoke to that. Our pastor didn't speak to it. I want to know what to think about it. They literally want to know. And so that's a big responsibility on me, because I've got to not let my bias or whatever, I got to really think it through. I got to vet it. So I'm not, being biased or speaking out of my flesh, but speaking the truth. And I had to speak some hard truth about what I saw going on, about in our country, about the election. It wasn't a matter of who I wanted to win. That's not even the point. But some of the things that just weren't true that are dividing our country, and some people definitely got offended by that. And some guy said some things that were kind of like, why can't black people just get over it, And so I had to explain, hey, try to explain the psychology of African Americans, I believe we've made progress. I'm not one of those who are like, oh, it's just as bad as it ever was. No, we've made progress. And the reality is most of my interactions with white people are good.
Sure.
I'm not running into Klan members every day.
Right.
But however, we still have issues. We've got to work. But I think we can celebrate the progress. And but yet there are people living in my congregation who had to go to the back door of the first McDonald's in Sarasota. They're sitting on the front row of my church. Who remember, my mother was the first black nurse in surgery. It says a memorial on how the doctors treated her. So you're talking about, so if you got people who are alive, and one of my father's friends had the grades to get into the University of Florida, but was denied admission because he's black, he's still alive. So that means this isn't ancient history.
Right.
And I had to help some people understand the psychology that there are still African Americans who live this.
Yeah. The civil rights movement probably wouldn't have happened to the degree it did without the leadership and courage of the black churches. Looks like the ARC could use some course correction. Who's going to take the leadership positions over this bridge in the future?
Listen, I think when you're fighting for justice, it's going to always be messy. I think even Dr. King's day, I think we forget how much resistance Dr. King got from black churches and black pastors. Now, in retrospect, we see the wisdom and the power.
Yeah.
And thank God for his strength. Thank God for his willingness to stand. But those were lonely years.
Yeah.
And so I think the fight for justice is always going to be kind of lonely for those who feel that burden. But it takes great courage and great sacrifice to stand up for what's right. I think all of us, churches, black and white, sometimes we need recalibrating to remember why we're here and not just having church or being a country club. Some churches can become glorified clubs.
And the young people are watching. A lot of people who marched with Martin Luther King and paved the way. They marched in the streets, the 60s, 70s. What is the equivalent of what our young people do today to accomplish what their forefathers did with all these movements?
I think the young people need to have the humility to be mentored.
Sure.
And I think those who've traveled a few miles have to have the patience and the humility and the desire to mentor.
Yeah.
And sometimes I see that disconnect. I'm forever grateful for the late Dr. Ed James. Dr. Ed James, and he was tough, man. I mean, he could be tough on us. But he would draw us to himself and explain why he did what he did, why he said what he said.
Sure.
And he really mentored us. And he told me, I never forget, he told me, he's like, listen, I'm tired. I'm getting tired. I'm leaving. You guys got to take up the baton. And I just remember, I was kind of through. I'm like, Dr. James, I'm done trying to serve the community. And I said, Doc, I'm through. I'm done, And he said, I'll never forget this. I remember where I was. I was in the parking lot of my church on the cell phone. He says, now, Pastor, God's not going to let you out of this. You got to serve. You got to get past this, and you got to go on. And I was like, whoa, it's not what I was expecting to hear. But I appreciate him mentoring us.
Yeah.
And I've been disappointed by some who didn't want to take young people, they almost treated people who were like her like outsiders. So I think the young, again, the Bible says he calls the old because they know the way, the young because they're strong. So you need strength and wisdom. And hopefully both can come together because we can't do this without each other.
Right. Thank you, Kelvin. Those are inspirational words for all generations, especially important for the young people responsible for continuing the struggle. And now, I mentioned her earlier, Sheila Sanders. If you're a Sarasota native, she needs no introduction. Her life reads like an encyclopedia of Sarasota Black history, but her story is far from one-dimensional. Listen closely. You will learn a lot. Sheila, welcome. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Black History 2022. Help us understand what it was like for you to grow up in this community in the 50s.
Sarasota was a very special place then and is now, just not for everybody. And that was part of the problem then, and it's part of the problem now. In the 50s, we had lots of people who visited here. And one of my biggest issues in the 50s was I've always been an avid reader. I read the books that they had in the library at school. I read the books in what we now call Robert L. Taylor, which was then the USO, which is where the library for Newtown was located. And I would go to the public library down in the 600 block on 41. One of my problems was that they allowed people who were visiting to check books out, but not somebody who lived here all the time. So I had to prove that my family owned the house we were living in order to be able to check books out of the library. And very often, the librarians were so kind, they let me just sit in the stacks and read as long as I wanted to. My dad worked for City's Transit, which means I had a free bus pass. I could get on the bus in front of the house, get off the bus in front of the library, and just sit and read all day, which I often did. And sometimes people would come through and say, "There's a little black girl sitting back there." And the librarians would say, "Oh, that's Sheila. She's okay. She's just reading." So, but I have a vivid memory of that. And people who were here for 2, 3 weeks, maybe a month visiting, could check books out. And I couldn't, and I felt that was grossly unfair. So that's one of my early unfair memories of life in Sarasota.
How long did that go on?
Well, let's put it this way. It was still going on until they moved out of that building into another building, and it became Selby Library. But then, too, I remember in 1960, when JFK was running for president, we had black and white water fountains in the courthouse in Sarasota County. And I had seen black and white water fountains. I had seen black and white bathrooms. And I'm thinking, everything's changing. We have this new young guy, because Eisenhower was, at that time, the oldest president we'd ever had, and JFK was the youngest president we'd ever had. So I'm thinking, everything's going to be different now that we're getting a younger person in office. And everything wasn't. Everything wasn't. And so I found that very disappointing.
What about the schools, the beaches?
The beaches were off limits. There was no written rule, but there was an unspoken rule. You don't belong here, you don't come out here. You're not good for tourism.
How did you process that when you were going through it? Do you remember?
I vividly remember I talked to everybody that would listen, and half those people that were not listening, according to the rest of my family. I talked to everybody from school to church, to Girl Scouts, to the YWCA, everything I was in, I talked to everybody. The inequities I had always seen and recognized, and I would call out. And even in 1966, when I went to work at the telephone company, I was told their customers were not ready to talk to Black operators. And I said, how will they know that I'm Black? They don't see me, they only hear me.
I want to hear about when you were in third grade, you organized a bank tour. What's that all about?
Well, it wasn't actually a bank tour. I found out that the bank where we were banking, which was a Federal Savings and Loan right there on good old Main Street, Sarasota, they would not allow us to have a tour of their bank. And they said they didn't do that. So I said, if they won't let us tour their bank, we don't need to have our money there. So instead of pennies, nickels, and dimes, I suggested everybody have a penny in their bank account until they decided to let us have a tour. I had gotten a roll of pennies from what was then Solomon's Grocery. It is no more, right on Osprey Avenue, 2 blocks from my house. And Miss Berta May and Mr. Solomon, who owned the store, Miss Berta May said, why do you need 50 pennies? And I said, just for these 2 quarters. And she gave me the 50 pennies, and I took the pennies to school, and I asked everybody in the class to only put 1 penny in their little bank folder for the week. And when everybody noticed that people that used to give a nickel had 1 penny. Everybody in the whole class had 1 penny. People that used to give a dime, there were a couple of people whose families were more prominent and could afford it, and they would occasionally put in a whole quarter, which was good money then. And when they were asked, why did you only put a penny in? Sheila Sanders told us. Sheila Sanders told us. So they didn't just mention Sheila. I was the only Sheila in the class.
Right.
They could have just said Sheila, but they say Sheila Sanders told us if we can't tour their bank, not to give them more than 1 penny. And she felt it would take them longer to process it with 1 penny than it would, and that would be making, everybody would know that we were mad about not getting a tour. We never did get a tour of that bank, and we never did stop dealing with that bank. But as soon as I turned 21, because you had to be 21 to do anything then, 18 didn't count. Okay, as soon as I turned 21, I went and I took everything out except $1.
Also, as a young adult, you participated in a landmark decision, a lawsuit that literally changed the history of the Sarasota City Commission elections. Tell me about that.
So by this time, I am in my late 20s, and I have a lot of experience dealing with situations that I felt uncomfortable in. So discomfort for me wasn't the same as discomfort for a lot of people. I really didn't expect to be comfortable, but I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a point, and I never backed off of a point. So I talked the president of the NAACP, who at that time was John Rivers. I talked the Ed James, who I had known forever. His grandmother and one of my aunts were best friends from when they were teenagers back in the 20s. And and Fred Jackson, William Fred Jackson, who owned what was then called the Weekly Bulletin, which was a newspaper. And I talked them into saying, we need to file a lawsuit. So the 4 of us filed that lawsuit.
Wow.
And we said we wanted district voting.
So do you feel that all the rights you fought for as a very young lady back then are under attack today?
Very much so. And part of that is because people do not realize what used to be.
Finally, you've seen a lot of changes here in Sarasota, some good, not so good, some not so good. In closing, please speak to our youth. What are the lessons of Black history? What have you learned for the struggle of equality that you would impart to the youth, and how they are going to respond to this as they move forward in the community?
I would say to the youth, do not live an inadvertent life. Live an intentional life. Let everything you do have meaning to you, even if to nobody else. Be intentional about every day, because every day is an opportunity to make a difference. Use your influence. May not go far, but let it go as far as it can.
Thank you, Sheila, for making a difference. That's what it's all about. Freedom, like democracy, is not a given. It is an ideal, not a thing. As the journey to create a more perfect union continues, we would do well to recall, respect, and recognize our common humanity. For without Black America, we would not be American. If you'd like to learn more about voting rights and Sarasota's Black history, you can visit these websites. And you can always watch this episode and all our previous shows on YouTube, Facebook, and my website. Well, that wraps up another one. Hope you learned something and enjoyed the show. I'm Suzanne Atwell. Thanks for watching. Please share with your friends, and we'll see you around town.
Atwell Media is a registered, not-for-profit 501c3. If you would like to support local public service programming like this, please visit our website, SuzanneAtwell.org, to make a tax-deductible donation. Thank you for watching.